Thank you for being with us tonight. This meeting has been brought to you in part by
Let Grand Forks International Airport help you start your next vacation off on the right foot. Grand Forks International Airport offers flights to the sunny destinations of Orlando, Las Vegas, and Phoenix on Allegiant, and connections anywhere in the world through Minneapolis-St. Paul on Delta. Forget the hassle of long drives, parking nightmares, and stressful check-ins. The convenience of flying locally means less headaches and more time for you. Grand Forks International Airport. Your airport. Simply grand.
Know what's in this box? Well, in case your crystal ball is broken, here's a hint. Safe, reliable energy, for starters, but there's also a commitment to this community. See, at Xcel Energy, this is our hometown. So we're not just about making a living here, we're about living here. Oh, I wish I had wings.
In our community, we're always delivering. Xcel Energy, responsible by nature.
Brantley Gilbert returns to Grand Forks. Fired Up Tour 2020 with special guests Chase Rice and Brandon Lay. Alara Center, Saturday, May 2nd. Get tickets now at Ticketmaster.com. The brand new album Fire and Brimstone drops everywhere October 4th. Brantley Gilbert, live in concert. Check more at BrantleyGilbert.com.
Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for November 6, 2019. Roll call.
Budke. Johnson. Kuhn. Lee. Lunsky. Matichak. Reichert.
Here.
Sandy. Wasvik. We have a quorum.
Reading and approval of the minutes for October 2nd, 2019. Has everyone read those? Do we have a motion? Second. Moved by Lunsky, second by Sandy. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Item 3.1.
Mr. Chair, if I may just have a quick announcement to make. We have Jane Beasley. She is now our new Senior Administrative Specialist. Sherilyn's no longer here, so Jane is on board for a whole, this is her third day of work.
Welcome.
So not expecting her to jump in head first, we have Stephanie Coleman. She's with our finance department, and she'll just be taking the meeting minutes tonight as we move forward. So we welcome Jane and we welcome Stephanie. Thank you. Okay, now I'm ready.
Thank you. Item 3.1.
Vacation of a portion of utility easement lying within Lot 2, Block 4 of Leclerc's addition located at 5509 Charlie Ray Drive.
Mr. Gangler.
Yes, this is sort of a minor cleanup on a situation. The house that you see depicted on the vacation map was built, I believe, in 2015, and it was recently discovered that a portion of the building actually encroaches into a 10-foot utility easement for a storm sewer pipe. And after looking at it and speaking with the property owners, we decided the best way to remedy this situation is to simply vacate that portion of the easement that the home encroaches on. So the entire easement itself stays intact. So it's just that area. It basically equates to, on average, about a 1.5 foot encroachment into the easement. And what that looks like on the map that we see, there is the existing storm sewer pipe that's it's pretty much on the lot line. So at this point, staff recommends approval of the vacation in order to allow for a clean title to the property.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Gangler? Back to the committee. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Coon.
Is that going to cause any problems if there has to be maintenance done on that storm sewer or replacement?
Oh, if I could.
Already getting into the area?
Because the pipe itself is right on the lot line, so there's still enough room, the 8 feet or so, to allow sufficient room if it does need repairs. Should provide, unlike a sanitary sewer that would be very deep most likely, but the storm sewer won't be as deep. So.
Thank you.
Any action by the commission? Entertain a motion. Moved by Sandy, second by Lunsky. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Item 4.1.
An ordinance amending sections 180204, rules and definitions, 180219, I-2 heavy industrial district side yard requirements, 180203, off-street parking and loading, 180309, landscaping sections of the Grand Forks City Code for the purpose of establishing allowances for gravel and requirements for curb and gutter landscaping in I-2 districts.
Ms. Edwardson.
Good evening. I understand that's quite the agenda item intro. But this was brought forward the commission maybe a few months ago. We talked about the need to look at the curb and gutter and gravel requirements for industrial properties. And so we've had a couple subcommittees and met and went through all of that. Given that we talked about this a few months ago, I'm going to run through the why very quickly. But if you have any questions as I'm going through it, breezing through it, let me know. We have had a few requests over the years for variances to vary the paving requirements. Right now, the city code requires that if you're in city limits, we don't allow gravel. So you're required to pave your properties. Most of our quite a few of our industrial sites have asked for variances to either delay that or remove that requirement. Board of Adjustments typically sees those requests because most of our industrial properties are conventionally zoned. Board of Adjustments handles conventional zones, you folks handle PUDs. Planning and Zoning has seen a couple of these requests in recent years, but for the most part, they do go through Board of Adjustments. Ironhide, Rocks and Blocks, and then probably Simonson Lumber are the ones that come to mind that you guys have seen recently. We were asked by one particular property owner that said, this really doesn't work. I have heavy machinery. Can you really look at your rules? So to start that process out, we checked with all the other communities in North Dakota to see what they allow. Turns out they do allow gravel for their industrial sites to be administratively approved through the site plan review process. That was the main indicator, I think, for staff to take a deeper dive into it, wanting to align with other communities to make sure we stay competitive and to just have an even playing field. Also to make it clear that if we are going to do this, where is it going to be allowed and how, and those kind of parameters. So we set out for that, looked at the different communities. Why only I-2? You'll see on the map the darker purple areas are I-2 areas. So there are periphery areas, industrial parks here. This one's a little bit of an outlier, as that's the Minn Kota and Retrax out on 32nd. But both of those facilities, Minn Kota is a beautiful facility from the corridor. You'd never know that there's maybe even gravel, which was allowed, I believe, in the back through a variance. But if we look at where the I-1 facility or areas are in town, that's our BNSF rail yard, our Xcel Energy rail yard in the middle of town, Montgomery's. North Washington has a strip of I-1, as well as the state fairgrounds, and then I think that's DOT offices there. So those I-1 areas are located near residential areas and in the core of our town, where we wanted to maintain higher aesthetic qualities, not allowing the gravel. So that's why it's just the I-2, the outliers. Makes more sense as I-2 is typically your heavy district with your heavy machinery and things like that, where it beats the asphalt or concrete or whatever, to make it an unreasonable request or requirement, I should say. The subcommittee met and gave direction for staff in terms of, yes, we're okay with allowing gravel. Parking stalls in industrial districts don't necessarily need to have curb and gutter unless they're on a corridor. A lot of the subcommittee's request was to maintain the aesthetics of our corridors, so requiring curb and gutter and requiring pavement, no gravel. If we do allow gravel, that it should be pulled off the property line, worried about the encroachment of gravel over the years, and that a landscaping line should be established to keep that creep in line or from going too far. Staff made an ordinance to kind of go through that and tweaked a little bit of what the subcommittee directed us to do. Instead of creating a new list of what corridors there were, we tied this to our existing corridor overlay district, so that we are tying to an existing code. We have some symmetry there. So if you're along a corridor, if you're an industrial property along a corridor, you cannot have gravel within that corridor area, which is typically about 400 feet off of the right of way. And you have to have curb and gutter for your requirements. We did include a 15-foot off the property line, and the landscaping was tweaked a little bit too, in that we took a look at our existing landscaping requirements. Between an industrial and industrial lot, there's a 10-foot buffer yard required between those two. In that 10 feet, there's 2 shade trees, 4 ornamental, and 5 shrubs per 100 feet. Typically, that's split up between the two property owners, but that to staff seemed to be a reasonable amount of landscaping to establish a line to stop the gravel creep, the fear of it going too far into a neighboring property. We thought that was sufficient enough. We didn't feel like we needed to go over and above with landscaping than that already. And then depending on what use you are, if you're industrial next to residential, there's a much larger buffer yard that we would hold to regardless. We don't have any I-2 properties next to residential that I'm aware of, so that's probably a poor example, but you get the theory behind it. So with that, and I will say that at every subcommittee meeting and even staff meeting, enforcement of gravel has always come up as a concern. How do we keep it from creeping? How do we keep it in line? Part of that is, quite honestly, it's tricky. Part of that's the balancing act between what we allow and what most of our enforcement is complaint-based, but we do have some responsibility to go out and try to keep on top of that. But I'm not a believer in that code needs to be written to be foolproof. The code should be written for the person who is going to do it the right way. It is our responsibility then to take on to make sure that if the rules are broken, that we're enforcing the rules. And so that's the way this code is written. It's not foolproof. Some of the responsibility will be on us to enforce the gravel, but I think we have a good baseline to establish what we would require and what we would require them to pull back to if it were to be taken too far. In addition to that, Stephanie and I, as planners and who review site plans, have started doing site inspections. Part of the process when a building permit is issued, you go through inspections. There's various levels of checks for the structural and things like that. Stephanie and I will now be going to the final inspections of those before a certificate of occupancy is granted to make sure the landscaping's in, the striping's in, the signage for ADA and stuff like that is in. So that's another level of us being more diligent with our enforcement and more intentional to make sure it's right from the get-go. So with that, all of those things were put into the ordinance. Few different sections had to be amended, rules and definitions, I-2 district, which had previous language for side yard setbacks, off-street parking, which included everything I just ran through, and then landscaping was also modified. We took out a portion of our landscaping code that we have not enforced, at least since I have been here, which is why there's a whole bunch of crossing out there. We do enforce the appendix, which says if you're this use next to this use, you have to follow this buffer yard. We do follow that diligently, and that's what is in place with the landscaping code. So with that, I would answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions by the commission? Seeing none, any discussion, any motions? Yes, go ahead, Mr. Budke.
So when Ironhide came before this body, that is not in the I-2 district. I believe it was some
Correct.
sort of
It was B3 plus a little bit more.
Okay, so you talked about the distinction between I-1 and I-2, why just I-2 is focused here. Was there any discussion in the subcommittees about other zones?
No, because other zones, we don't want to administratively approve that process. We did include in there where curb and gutter is required now to make it more clear that for all other areas it's required along the perimeters, and then any landscaping island aspects of it. Typically in all other zones, the site is used to its fullest potential, that you always end up with curb and gutter on the required. But in terms of like Ironhide, that was in a commercial zone and next to an I-2 corridor, or I-29 corridor, excuse me. That should be something that's reviewed by this body as a variance. Does it make sense from its location? Does it make sense in its use, its intended use, to allow that temporarily, time delay, permanently, whatever you want to make that motion to be. Commercial corridors should be evaluated if the request is there. And they have to make a strong case. Probably prior to you, Alex, you might remember the Simonson Lumber on Gateway Drive request. They were putting a lumber yard in there and wanted to have gravel or aggregate crushed concrete. That one was not approved by this board because its location in town on a major corridor, proximity to central, and then its proximity to residential, it was not approved. Same zoning district as Ironhide. Little use probably wasn't as intense as a heavy machinery, but its proximity and its location were a key factor, and so those should be variants and reviewed separately.
All right, thank you.
Yes. Any other questions? Do we have a motion? Moved by Johnson, is there a second? Second by Kuhn. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, we'll vote. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Reports from the Planning Department. Mr. Gangler.
We weren't going to let you get off that easily with such a short agenda, so we thought we'd use the time appropriately just to have for now it'll be a brief discussion. We'll cover a few items that intended on to bring forward more discussion probably at the December meeting and just moving forward in general. So the first area, we haven't updated the commission bylaws in quite some time. There is some archaic language in it that is no longer needed or required. So we're going to at least highlight to let you know that there are some areas that we think will need to be addressed or at least discussed. One area is, of course, the change in membership. We went from 15 to 9, so it's those housekeeping things throughout the bylaws that just need to be updated. Some other points that I'd like to run by. Right now, the bylaws indicate that as far as the executive positions, it's annual elections and no one officer should serve more than 2 consecutive years. I think due to the composition of the commission, I think we should talk and look at redefining that in terms of length of how many years you can serve in a given position. Because quite frankly, due to schedules, timing, somebody may not want to be, the president, for example. So I think we should at least discuss those, as well as discuss the individual duties of the executive committee. There is some cleanup that I noticed that needs to be tended to. Most of you should be familiar with our subcommittee process. There is a brief note in the bylaws that discuss it. I'd like for us to maybe take a look at honing in on how we can improve how the bylaws apply to our subcommittees, make them more of a formalized process rather than more of that informal setting. And then in terms of ethics and procedures, you should have, one of your handouts is a draft, just kind of a cheat sheet with some bullet points of the different types of procedures and motions that we deal with on not all of them, but a good part of them on a routine basis. We don't plan on, and this isn't intended to get into a deep discussion tonight, but we know that we have some varying opinions as to the proper procedures to follow when you recuse or request to recuse from a vote. Some of the things that we've looked at as far as Robert's rules and other provisions, it seems to be lacking. The information out there seems to be lacking as to a solid procedure, whether it requires a motion and a second. There's a policy that was adopted by the City Council that we'll need to take a look at. That was, I believe it was ethics and procedures, and part of the adoption of that by the council, within it states that it should apply to all of the other boards and commissions. So we need to kind of take a look at that to see how that applies to our process. There's varying degrees of, for example, when somebody wants to recuse themselves from a vote, our current guidelines, it doesn't state whether you need a first and second, but it does state that the person needs to basically fully disclose of why they're recusing the purpose for recusing. So on that same note, the premise of recusing is based on, in the bylaws, we refer to it as personal interest, otherwise known as a conflict of interest or those types of things. And just as an example, we define that in the bylaws, personal interest broadly, define personal interest broadly to include any actual or potential benefits or advantages that they, a spouse, family member, or person living in their household might directly or indirectly obtain from a planning decision. So we want to see what we can do to make that more understandable and more, maybe if there is a way to get more clarity to that. I think that's something we need to talk about. And then lastly, one of your handouts is just something that Andrea found through the University of Minnesota Extension Service, just kind of more of a refresher on the ground rules for, during the conduct of a meeting. Tonight, that's just provided to you just as like I said, a little refresher. And that will come up then again when we try to refine our bylaws to see where it's appropriate to make certain statements. And with that, if we have the available staff time and whatnot, we may come back with yet another presentation next month, maybe with the assistance of the city attorney to get into more detailed discussion on Robert's rules and some of those procedures for meetings. And then, if nobody has any questions?
Brad, is there a place where the bylaws are? I should probably know this, but are they online? Or if not, can you email them?
Right, yeah, they are not, so we will shoot you the Word document via email, and you can take a look at some of these, as well as contemplate any other changes you see that might be appropriate, or at least get an understanding of what they're all about.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then the last item on the agenda, 6.2, we just wanted to take some time to make a few announcements to you, give you a heads up on some of the things that are coming up. So Andrea has the first announcement.
So most of you should have gotten an email for downtown design standards. We're going to have meetings the 13th and 20th Alex gets to attend just because he's already on the Downtown Design Review Board. Andrew's expressed interest as well. We can't necessarily have a quorum, but if anybody else is interested from the P&Z to sit on those design standards, please let me know. November 13th and 20th, 8:30 to probably about 10 o'clock in room A102 down in City Hall. So if you're interested, I can send you the packet to kind of run through it. If you're not, once that process kind of wraps up or hits a good point to bring it forward to you as an update, we'll be doing that. So.
Thank you. Ms. Halford?
We'll be talking about the census for the next 30 minutes. I have 50 slides. Only kidding.
And the next several months.
I'd like to recuse myself.
Only kidding. It's about 15, but I'll go through it really quickly. So if you haven't heard yet, the census is coming up. Our department's been given the task to kind of spearhead the outreach education for our community. We also been partnering with the county as well as East Grand Forks. So why do we do the census? Basically, this is how we basically, our community gets its fair share of $675 billion per year in federal funds. We use these funds for grants, support for basically Medicaid, our schools, streets, public works department. It's used for a lot of things like that. So we want to get our fair share. Another example is basically our congressional changes. This is just an example from last time where Texas gained 4 seats, both New York and Ohio lost 2. We think Texas will probably gain another 3 after this next census. So another important reason why we do the census and why you should do it. This slide really spoke to me. Basically, every person that's missed, they're worth $1,900 a year. You kind of can look at it. So everyone that's not counted, you can look at it that way. So it kind of really compiles after that. Every 10 years, because we're stuck with that number for 10 years, it's basically we're missing out on $19,000. So it's huge. Then you can look at household. Even if the state's off by 0.1%, I mean, that equals up to $15 million a year. So it's very important. It makes a difference, and basically everyone counts kind of thing. So a different thing for this next census, we didn't have this last time. You'll be able to do the census online, by mail or by phone. Kind of looking back and a fun little thing. I mean, 10 years ago, we used to have Blockbuster stores. Now we have Netflix. So it's kind of fun to look at that, how much we've changed. So they're going to be really pushing for that, the online. And then another thing to go over is there's a lot of been concerns about information being shared. So the census employees are not allowed to share any information with other departments. It's actually a 5-year imprisonment as well as a $250,000 fine if they share within why they're employed and afterwards. So it's a pretty hefty thing if you share information. So again, the planning department's been tasked with this. So we have what they call a complete count committee. We formed that. It's about 50 people are on that committee. It ranges from all sorts of departments within the city as well as other organizations within the community and county and neighboring communities. So they have started this a couple censuses ago. This is basically, they've noticed that people don't really trust a federal employee coming to your door. People respond a lot better when your neighbor or a more familiar face comes to you and talks about the census. So they thought they better keep doing that. The education should come from the community. So kind of looking at the quick timeline. Right now we're in the middle of the education phase and going to the awareness phase. This is basically just talking with the different groups in the community that the census is easy, it's important, and it's safe. Then we'll be looking at more of the motivational phase. This will be in March into April, which is a very important time because in the middle of March is when you'll start getting those packets in the mail about the census, where it'll push you to go online to fill out your census, which you can start doing March 12th. And then you'll start getting more information after that. And then April 1st is Census Day, but you can start filling out your census beginning of March, in the middle of March. Then you'll start getting more reminders in the mail, as well as you might start to see people come to your door saying, fill out your census, it's important, it's safe. And then it's July 31st is the last day you can fill out the census. Then we'll go into the thank you phase, which is in August. Again, since so many people are involved with this movement and outreach, that we'll spend some time reaching out to those groups again and thanking them for their support. Lots of jobs are open. If you want to be a census worker, part-time, I heard they pay well. And then coming up, we're having a census solution workshop. So the whole committee is coming together next Thursday from 11 to 2. If you would like to be part of that, you can reach out to me and we would love to have you. Any questions? Fill out your census.
Okay, we won't torture you too much longer. I just have a few points of interest to let you know about. Some of you have been involved in our land use plan update. Some of you haven't. We're going to embark on now this next process of updating the year 2045 land use plan. And the land use plan is our overall roadmap, both figuratively and literally, of where we're going now into the future, possibly a 20-year horizon. It's quite a process. There's times staff will do it just in-house, and there's times where we work through the MPO because the land use plan is directly tied to the long-range transportation plan. So first we update the land use plan, and with that information then the MPO spearheads the process of updating the transportation plan. I think now we're at a point where there are a lot of issues that have been brought up, whether it's bridges or the development of the city, where are we growing, opposed to maybe years in the past where things really weren't debatable or things being discussed. So I think it's critical, again, now more than ever, that not only staff be very directly involved, but the commission as well. So we will be forming the land use subcommittee. And so we're very early in the stage. We don't know how many people we may want or set meeting dates. But where we're at now is the planning department will meet with the MPO to go over the RFP and the scope of work. The MPO has a certain amount of money that they'll allocate to hiring a consultant to assist us through the process. That's been done in varying ways throughout the years. There's been times where consultants have taken sort of the active role or more of a lead. This time we want to make sure the process is more staff and commission oriented as much as we can to make sure that our final product is something that we understand and what we want. So that meeting with the MPO will occur next week, and we're going to frame it, discuss it, and then the idea then is to bring back to the commission as a whole, probably in December, with sort of that roadmap of how we're going to go about doing the RFP and what we want to see in our scope of work. Once that gets finalized, then it's the process of actually writing the RFP, sending it out, and at some point soon then we should have a better idea of when we'll actually start the process. Right now we're expecting it to be a 2020, 2021 overall process, so it's not something a one and done deal by any means. So again, stay tuned for that. We're kind of excited about this time around to really just dig deep into it and look at our long range plan. And speaking of the census, I'm not going to go over her presentation again, but from time to time I've mentioned that our sign code needs to be updated. And at this point it's not necessarily a matter of do we want to update it or not. In 2005, the city adopted a pretty comprehensive amendment to the sign code, primarily relating to outdoor advertising, otherwise known as billboards. Within that discussion, what came out in code form was a cap on the total number of billboards that were allowed in the city and our 2-mile extraterritorial zoning. So it was set. Well, since then, we've reached the cap. So in 2010, we did a recount based on the population increase. The ordinance says that for every increase in 566 people in population, one more billboard can be added to the overall inventory. Now, that was based on a decision, again, back in 2005. They took the population, they literally just counted all the billboards in our jurisdiction, did the math, turned out to be one billboard for 566, give or take. There's some other math involved. So that's going to be the lead on whether or not the idea would be, if the code isn't changed, we would take the 2020 census, which won't be available towards the end of the year into the next. But we've had a lot of discussions over billboards over the years. What was written in 2005, in my opinion, is in need of dire assistance in terms of what was the original intent versus what we have now this many years later. So that process will also start relatively soon. There's still some research that I need to do to sort of educate myself even a little bit more as to what was passed and what we think we need to change. And then also just in general, as some of you already sat on sign subcommittees or we've had discussions about how complex these things can actually get with signage issues. So there's other parts of the code that we also will in general take a look at. And then lastly, we do need to fill one vacant position on the commission. Paula Lee is no longer serving on the commission, and we've done some advertising now for applications, and we have now currently 3 on board. So we'll close that window application process probably relatively soon. Then there's a interview process that we started a number of years ago, where myself, the chair, and a city council member and the city administrator is sort of the review committee, where we interview the applicants. We have sort of a set number of questions, so we ask each one the same questions. We do our evaluation, and we then make a recommendation to the mayor. If the mayor accepts the recommendation, then he makes that appointment, and then it needs to be confirmed by council. So it's a process. Nevertheless, we just need to fill that vacant position. So with that, we don't have anything else.
Thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn? Mr. Kuhn, seconded by Mr. Lunsky. Meeting adjourned.
So what?
Thank you for being with us tonight. This meeting has been brought to you in part by
Let Grand Forks International Airport help you start your next vacation off on the right foot. Grand Forks International Airport offers flights to the sunny destinations of Orlando, Las Vegas, and Phoenix on Allegiant, and connections anywhere in the world through Minneapolis-St. Paul on Delta. Forget the hassle of long drives, parking nightmares, and stressful check-ins. The convenience of flying locally means less headaches and more time for you. Grand Forks International Airport, your airport, simply grand.
Know what's in this box? Well, in case your crystal ball is broken, here's a hint. Safe, reliable energy, for starters, but there's also a commitment to this community. See, at Xcel Energy, this is our hometown. So we're not just about making a living here, we're about living here. Oh, I wish I had wings.
In our community, we're always delivering. Xcel Energy, responsible by nature.
Brantley Gilbert returns to Grand Forks. Fired Up Tour 2020 with special guests Chase Rice and Brandon Lay. Alara Center, Saturday, May 2nd. Get tickets now at Ticketmaster.com. The brand new album Fire and Brimstone drops everywhere October 4th. Brantley Gilbert, live in concert. Check more at BrantleyGilbert.com.